Hello there and welcome to this week's Granny's Garden. Now this week we're going to be having a look at the Italian cypress, or in particular or more specifically, two floppy Italian cypresses. Now in this week's episode I'm going to be talking about two varieties in particular, the Totem and the Stricta, the differences between the two and the pros and cons of the two. I'm also going to be talking about why your tree is floppy in the first place, what you can do to prevent it, and how you can make it unfloppy, because once it's flopped, it won't unflop by itself. I'm also going to be explaining the overwhelming, or trying to make sense of the overwhelming, conflicting and contradictory information there is on the internet about the Italian cypress. I'm also going to be taking you on a field trip to show you what an Italian cypress should look like if it's given the type of care that I like. I'm going to be doing a bit of myth busting along the way, and being me, I'm going to tell you to do something that everywhere else is telling you not to do. But that's me, isn't it? And while you're at it, hit the subscribe button. What's in a name? Well, in the case of the Italian cypress, everything. It's known as the common, the Italian, the pyramidal, the churchyard, the Mediterranean. Really everything except what it should be known as, which is the Persian. So that's myth number one out the window. The Italian cypress isn't in actual fact Italian at all. It hails from Persia, which is the modern day Iran. That isn't to say that they don't grow beautifully in Italy, and any picture postcard of the Tuscany region of Italy is going to show you kilometres and kilometres of these beautiful, delightful Italian cypresses reaching up to the sky. And they certainly know how to grow them there. It's very rare to find a floppy one there because they treat them as they should be. Also, the climate is perfect. They get these drought periods, these hot, dry summers with a good drought period, and they get the cool winters. Because these fellas can stand winters of up to minus 10 degrees Celsius. So if you get really, really cold winters, like minus 20 degrees Celsius or below, don't buy an Italian cypress. You're only going to make it miserable. As promised, we're here on our field trip. We're in a park on the north side of Madrid, and as you can see, it's virtually linear. And it faces east-west. Now in Madrid there are two prevailing winds, one from the west and one from the north, and very, very rarely from the south or the east. The reason I'm saying this is with prevailing winds from the west, this should be a wind tunnel, and therefore anything to do with the cypress, Italian cypress should have a lot of flop, but it doesn't. Now you're going to hear time and time again when talking about Italian cypresses, they don't need pruning, or directly don't prune them. And I'm saying, don't pay a blind bit of attention to this. They need pruning if you want them to look good. Now, I am very reluctant to use the word prune or to use the word cut. Therefore, what I'm going to say is, think of it as if it's a topiary. You give it light snips very frequently, at least once a year, better even twice. With all this light snips, it becomes dense, very, very dense. It is so dense that it is very, very difficult for wind to buffet it or for snow to land on it and push it out. Very, very difficult indeed to get yourself in there and push down a branch. They are so tight-knit, it is absolutely wonderful. This tall one here to the left is the equivalent of a 4-storey block of flats, which means that this particular tree is 13 metres tall already. And it has got very, very little flop of any note. Wonderful specimen. Now what I also want to show you is that they start off very early. Now here is a younger specimen, and yet if I get close you can see that it's more open than the other ones. There is slightly more like a hollowness. It is beginning to look quite nice and build itself up. And then if I come over to the wee little baby here, as you can see, they haven't started trimming this, and you can see the difference. Look at this. Look at all this flop. Now I'd imagine they're going to come here this spring and start with their first pruning on this one and get it into shape and knock it into shape. Now what you're seeing here is something completely different. This is due to bad location. It's been situated underneath these pines, which are evergreen, so it's not getting enough light. So as you can see, it is completely threadbare. So location for these trees is important. They need sun. Now here you've got another group, and I want to show you something quite interesting. The one on the left is dead. It's brown right from the bottom right up to the top. Now they should really take this tree down and remove it immediately. This is a first cousin of the Leylande, And if you've seen my videos, why is my cypress hedge turning brown? I'm going to leave the link below in the description. It could be from many causes, but particularly from Ceridium. And worse still, it's very contagious. And if we travel over here, I see that they have now cut out several branches, probably that were already getting dieback. And I can see some browning going on, which is not looking good. It's not heavily affected, but they've certainly had to cut branches out. So they really need to get rid of this tree as soon as possible, because if I get up close and personal, you can see this is completely dead, and most likely it's been Ceridium, but they really need to take it out. Well, it's the following day and we're back in the garden. It's nice and sunny out, but it's absolutely freezing. So let's crack on. There are three main uses for Italian cypresses in gardens. Now, the first, if you have a very imposing house, would be to line a driveway or a laneway up to the house. The second would be as privacy screening. You might want to block out a view that you don't particularly like, or block out the neighbour's house. And the third, like these, would be as standalone trees within a landscape to give vertical interest to the garden. We've seen that Italian cypresses are very, very tall and very, very thin. So they need to be staked right from the beginning to keep them properly vertical. If not, they're going to start leaning or flexing. And as you've seen, they're very, very vigorous, so they very soon outgrow that stake. When a grower tells you that the Italian cypress grows vigorously for the first few years of its life, these are really vague statements. These babies behind me have a lifespan of 600 years and sometimes even up to 1,000 years. So the first few years of their life is not the same as the first few years of a human life. So just keep that in mind, that this tree is going to be growing, and depending what age you are when you plant it, they might see us pushing up daisies long before they've reached their maturity. These Italian cypresses were staked with a long metal rod. As you can see, just follow it up here at my hand. And at some point, the tree actually engulfed it. Now, the three cypresses I have are standalone trees, but I'm going to let you in on a little secret. In actual fact, it's not just one tree, but two. This is absolutely ingenious. The one on the left is the narrower Stricta, and the one on the right is a Totem. They planted them very close together, so that by the time the Totem outgrew its stake, the foliage between the two of them, or the branches between the two of them, had fused, and the Stricta became a living stake for the Totem, a stroke of genius. And if I pull back here, you'll see that the Stricta here on the left has kept the Totem beautifully straight all these years. And you can see that the actual Stricta is lower and more compact than the Totem, but it has acted as a living stake all of these years. I've never seen it done before, and it's absolutely brilliant. Now, since we have both varieties, the Stricta and the Totem, side by side, let's discuss some more internet twaddle. Statement. You can easily tell the difference between a Stricta and a Totem because of the colour of their foliage. Wrong. Totem, Stricta. If you can tell the difference between the two, I'll take my hat off to you. Statement. The Stricta is a dwarf variety, rarely exceeding 4 metres in height. Wrong. If we have a look at the two of them, soaring upwards. Now, the Stricta on the left, you will see, is shorter and more compact than the Totem to the right. These are 25 years old, and as I've said, they're in their infancy. They're still toddlers. The Totem on the right will eventually reach 30 metres in height, whereas the Stricta on the left will eventually level off somewhere between 12 to 18 metres high, usually around about the 15 metre height. So, if you are looking for a narrow tree no more than 4 metres in height, this is the wrong one for you, because this is going to level off at 15 metres. And between 15 metres and 4 metres, that's one heck of a difference. Statement. The Totem is sterile. Well, if I zoom up here, hopefully you'll be able to see it, you'll see there's quite a few cones hanging around, so it is definitely not sterile. I do, however, have to make one clarification, which may be the reason why people think it's sterile. This plant needs cold winters or a cold period during the year to form those cones. If it's planted in an area where there's really no winters and it's hot all year round, you tend to get a lot of foliage and little to no cones. One of the easiest way to distinguish one tree or one variety from the other is the actual structure of the tree itself. Now, if we look at the Stricta, which is on the left, it has a very well-defined tree trunk. It has a single trunk that goes right the full way up, and when you get to the top of the tree, it has a well-defined leader. The Totem, however, tends to be wider. It often branches out at the base, and these can often fuse together, giving this sort of like multi-trunk aspect. And obviously it's a lot wider, it's a lot taller, but when you get to the top, it doesn't necessarily have a single leader. You can actually have several leaders up there, which makes it less pointy and more of a mounded shape as opposed to a point. There is unfortunately one other aspect or one other main difference between the two of them. The Totem has a tendency to have more open branches, and it has a tendency to get floppy. And the older it gets, the floppier it gets. If you see here on the right, all the floppiness is on the Totem side. I don't know if you can see, I'll turn the camera around in a few minutes. But the left-hand tree, the Stricta, has got virtually no floppiness at all. So why do cypress trees get floppy in the first place? But as we've just discussed, part of it has definitely got to do with variety. Things like the Totem are definitely more susceptible to be floppy. And the way to counteract it is, as we've seen on the field trip, is to treat it as a topiary right from the beginning. So instead of becoming open, it becomes dense and mat-like, and therefore it's very difficult to become floppy later on in its life. Certainly there are varieties like the Stricta, and there's a newer variety I think called Tiny Towers that have been bred specifically not to become floppy. But there is another huge reason for floppiness, and this is mainly caused by us, and that is too much water. In its natural environment, this tree normally goes for spring, summer and autumn without receiving any water at all, and then in winter it receives enough rain to give its water requirements for the entire year. So it is a drought-tolerant tree, and a tree that needs this drought period. We have a tendency to overwater things, and even worse, to put irrigation tubes near it. So get those irrigation tubes as far away as possible. And if you want to give the tree a drink, give it a deep drink very now and again, but do not give little and often. In its natural state, these periods of drought allow the growth not only to grow tall, but to grow wide. And because the branches are thicker, it can withstand the weight of its greenery. If you're giving it too much water, or it's getting too much water, it shoots up very quickly branches that are spindly, thin, over-flexible, and they just can't stand the weight of the greenery. And any type of wind, heavy rain, or worse still, snow, will get it to bow out. And as I've said before, once it flops, it doesn't unflop. So what can I do? Well, the first thing I'm going to tell you is what not to do, and that is follow any advice on the internet that tells you to get hold of this big floppy branch and cut it out. These are first cousins of the Leylandi, and once you get down to the brown branches, you're going to get no new growth ever from those brown branches. So if I cut out the floppy branch, all I'm going to be left is with a big brown gaping hole, possibly for years. I would have to wait for the surrounding green branches to grow long enough to try and tie them into place to cover that gaping hole that I created in the first place. So, message is, don't cut out any floppy branches. You have to repair them. So what you need is either a very soft wire, a soft protected wire, or lengths of twine, and one by one tie in those branches into that vertical place and cover up those holes they've left, and that's the only way forward. If the tree is young enough, you can spiral some fishing wire around it to give the tree time enough for those branches to get wider and thicker and to be able to support their own weight, and then just cut it out. So I'm going to show you now how to tie in a few branches so you know what to do in the future. But what I will say is prevention is better than cure. It's important that it doesn't receive too much water. It's important that maybe you select the correct variety. And what is important is that right from the very beginning, you keep snipping and shearing at it lightly to make it denser and thicker so it's not susceptible to flop in the first place. Now, in order to repair the droopy branches of our Italian cypress, it's necessary to tie them back into a vertical position. Now, I have here on the table a selection of what would be normal tie-backs in the garden. Now, this first one we're going to eliminate immediately because this is like a very, very thin wire. And even if you put this around the branch very loosely, any movement caused by wind or growth is going to rub in and cause a lot of damage on the bark and will eventually lead to an infection. So we're eliminating that immediately. There's also the possibility of using a zip wire or a zip tie, and yep, it's okay if you put it around loosely. There's room for movement. It has a slight cutting edge, but certainly nothing like the other one, and it wouldn't be my first option, but it would be okay. For light branches or light droopy branches, one of the best options would be just a normal garden twine or a ute twine. And again, you just tie it around the edge of the branch, tie it around the base of the tree or the trunk of the tree or a different branch, always leaving room for growth. This would be a great option for lighter branches. Any other type of cord that's smooth or not likely to cut in is also valid if you have it around the house. As regards heavier branches, my option would definitely be something like a soft tie. Now, I use this always with my roses. It's got wire on the inside, so it does stay in the position that you position it in. But it has got a very, very soft covering. So even if you tie this loosely and there's movement with the branch, it's not going to do any damage whatsoever. And it is really, really strong. So perfect for those very heavy, droopy branches. So definitely I would recommend this for heavier ones. Garden soft ties. Now I'm just going to show you this segment, mainly because it's at my height and I won't have to get up on a ladder and film at the same time. These branches are nice and green, but once you get inside, you'll see that the branches are brown. Now, this part is capable of producing growth, this part not. So if you were following internet advice saying you cut the branch off, you don't. If I cut it at this level, I'm just going to have a stub sticking out, which is never going to grow any new growth. And if I cut it right back to the trunk, I'm going to be left with a hole. So you repair it. So think of it like as if it was a fake Christmas tree after the holiday period. You're going to be packing it away and you're going to be folding up the branches layer by layer. So what I do is I take these branches, I'm going to be tying them back one at a time, layer by layer, as if it's this like fake Christmas tree, until you get the whole completely repaired. This last one up here. And if that's tied back into shape, and get the ones further up here as well, that's the only way to do it. And you never know there was any problem here in the first place. I'm going to get this slightly larger one here, which is going to cover this hole here. So I'm just going to tie this off first. To tie that in, making sure it's covering all the holes, and to get inside the tree first, get a nice brown branch that's pretty useless inside, and fluff it out. Now that's a nice vertical branch. Look, it's completely vertical again, and yes, the string is loose enough to let it breathe. And even if it's buffeted by the wind, it's not going to go any further than that. So that's a repair done. Now that is looking a lot neater already. And as you can see, all these branches that were flopping have now disappeared and we're getting a nice vertical line there. Now, the last thing I'm going to be showing you is spiraling. This would be on a young tree. Now, unfortunately, I don't have any young cypress trees here in my garden. These ones are 20 plus years old. So think of it like as if a lanky teenager that's growing so fast that its branches don't have enough time to spread out a bit. So you get this gangly, lanky teenager. So I've got this fishing wire. This is quite a thick fishing wire, 0.8 millimeters. And I've just made a loop on one side. And I put the soft wire inside that loop, and I'm going to be tying this down to the very lowest branch, and I'm going to be spiraling it around the tree. Now, if it was a young tree, you'd be able to spiral it right up to the top. As I said, I won't be doing that because I can't reach, but it's just for demonstration purposes anyway. And you'd leave it in place until such time as the branches are wide enough to be able to support the weight of the greenery they have, and then you just cut it out, and that's all there is to it. Okay, so I have prepared now some fishing line. This is a 0.8mm fishing line, and on both ends I've got 2 little loops prepared, and inside those loops I've just attached a little bit of soft wire just so I won't be fumbling around when I'm trying to do the spiral. So what I'm going to do is now link one end to the bottommost branch, or in my case I'm actually going to make use of the iron rod that's already in place. What is important now is the distance between the lines as you're spiraling it round. Now, it shouldn't be overly big, something like a foot, or it shouldn't be overly small, something like 3 inches, but somewhere between the 6 to 8 inches would be absolutely perfect. What is important is to make sure as you spiral that all the branches are pushed as far into a vertical position as they can. So, let's get cracking. The last thing you saw me do there was just getting some of the smaller leaves and just putting it outside the fishing line to fluff it up a bit and make it a little more aesthetically pleasing. You're going to be removing the fishing line anyway when the branches get a little bit wider, but until then, if you can camouflage as well, all the better. Well, this has been a lot of information packed into one video, so I hope you've been able to take all of it in. Certainly my idea was to try and make sense of a lot of information that was coming through the internet, particularly such contradictory messages. Anyway, for the moment I'm not going to say any more, and I hope to see you next Friday here in Granny's garden. Bye bye now.